My name is Hazel Kingsley. I was 24 the day my husband Wyatt was buried, and instead of holding my hand, my parents pulled me into a church vestibule and told me to give my newborn triplets away. I stood there in a borrowed black dress that smelled faintly of mothballs, balancing a double stroller with my foot, while my mother slid an adoption brochure into my diaper bag. My father checked his watch and explained that my medical debt made me a financial liability. My mother told me they refused to let my bad luck bankrupt their retirement. They offered me a check for $500 and told me to figure it out. What they did not know was that 5 years later I would sell a vineyard for $150 million. And what I did when they showed up to claim their share is the reason they can never show their faces in our hometown again. Welcome to Orange Vengeance, where we tell stories about ordinary people who stop begging for a seat and build their own table. If the people who were supposed to protect you ever treated you like a bad investment, tell me your age in the comments and be sure to subscribe. Let me take you back to the rain. The Oregon storm hit the cedar shingles of St. Jude's like thrown gravel. I stood near the back pew, listening to the eulogy end. Noah, Liam, and Harper were 5 weeks old. They had been out of the neonatal intensive care unit for exactly 4 days. I balanced Harper against my collarbone. My arms ached deep in the joints. I had not slept for more than 40 consecutive minutes in a month. Martin and Helen, my parents, had driven down from Portland that morning. They wore tailored charcoal coats that repelled the dampness rather than absorbing it. They did not smell like the wet wool and damp earth of the Willamette Valley farmers filling the pews. They smelled like expensive dry cleaning and impatience. As the final prayer echoed through the sanctuary, my father stepped up beside me. His hand closed over my elbow. It was not a comforting grip. It was a steering mechanism. He guided me away from the lingering guests, pushing open the heavy oak doors that led to the dim wood-paneled vestibule. My mother followed, clicking the doors shut, sealing us off from the mourners and the quiet hum of sympathy. Hazel, my father began. He kept his voice lowered to a boardroom murmur. We need to discuss the reality of your situation. I shifted Harper's weight. She stirred, letting out a small, fractured sigh. I told him the burial was in an hour and that I needed to get the babies out to the car. My mother stepped closer. She did not reach out to touch her granddaughter. Instead, she adjusted the frayed collar of my borrowed dress, brushing off a piece of lint only she could see. The burial is ceremonial, darling, she said. The reality is what happens tomorrow. You have a mountain of hospital debt and zero income. I told them I would find a way, that Wyatt had a small life insurance policy that would buy me a few months. My father interrupted. He pointed out that the policy would barely cover a year of formula for 3 children, let alone a mortgage or childcare. He crossed his arms and told me to strip the emotion from the situation. You have no equity, he said. You are, from a practical standpoint, a liability. The word dropped onto the tile floor. Liability. I looked at the man who had paid for my piano lessons and my college degree. He was not looking at a grieving daughter. He was looking at a sinking stock. My mother placed her manicured hand over her leather purse. She told me they had spoken with a specialist in Portland. She said there were agencies and families waiting for infants, people who could provide the kind of stability I currently lacked. My throat closed tight. The vestibule walls seemed to shrink around us. I asked if they were seriously telling me to give up my children while my husband was still in the next room. My mother corrected me. She said they wanted me to salvage my life. We spent 2 decades investing in your future, Hazel, she said. We are not going to drain our retirement to fund a tragedy. It just is not sustainable. My father nodded, assuming my silence was surrender. He reached into his coat, pulled out his checkbook, and wrote a check for $500. He held it out and said it would cover rent for a few weeks while I made the arrangements. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I looked down at the stroller. Liam's tiny chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. Noah slept beside him, a knit cap slipping over one ear. Harper rooted against my neck. They were breathing. They were here. I did not take the check. I turned the stroller around, pushed the heavy outer door open with my shoulder, and walked out into the freezing rain. They were not offering a safety net. They were handing me a pair of scissors and asking me to cut the rope myself. 2 weeks passed, measured only by the daily arrival of the mail carrier dropping fresh disasters into the metal slot of my front door. My cheap laminate kitchen table became a graveyard of final notices. There was a separate taller stack reserved just for the hospital bills. Wyatt had spent 10 days in the intensive care unit before his lungs finally gave out and his heart stopped. The triplets had spent their first 3 weeks of life in neonatal incubators, wired to monitors that beeped in a rhythm that still echoed in my ears. The resulting paperwork formed a mountain of debt I could never hope to climb. The final blow arrived on a Tuesday morning, a bright pink eviction notice taped securely to the peeling paint of my apartment door. I had 72 hours to vacate the premises. I had $12 in my checking account. Pride is a luxury for people who can afford to feed their children. I packed the babies into their heavy plastic car seats. My postpartum body was still healing, and my arms shook from the sheer effort of lifting them. A double stroller did not fit through the narrow door of my rusted Subaru Outback, so I had to carry the seats out to the parking lot one by one. The Oregon rain had not stopped since the day of the funeral. It soaked through my thin cotton jacket, chilling my skin and matting my hair to my forehead. I secured the seats in the back row. Noah was hungry and began to wail a sharp, piercing sound. Harper joined him a moment later. Liam just stared up at the sagging fabric of the car roof, his small face pale in the gray light. I got behind the wheel, turned the key, and drove toward Lake Oswego. The transition from my fading neighborhood to my parents' zip code felt like crossing an invisible border into a different country. The cracked, potholed pavement smoothed out into pristine, tree-lined streets. Long, sweeping driveways stretched behind tall, wrought iron gates. The smell of wet pine mixed with the scent of expensive cedar shingles and manicured landscaping. I pulled my sputtering car up to the front of their sprawling, modern estate. The engine knocked loudly, vibrating through the steering column before I finally cut the ignition. The physical reality of moving 3 infants alone is a brutal arithmetic. I unbuckled Noah and Harper, hooking one heavy plastic carrier over each of my forearms. The plastic handles bit deep into my skin. I left Liam in the car, locked the doors, and hauled the first 2 up the wide slate walkway. My boots tracked dark mud onto the spotless white concrete of the sweeping front porch. I rang the brass doorbell with my elbow, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The heavy mahogany door swung open. My mother stood there wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater and tailored slacks. Behind her, the grand foyer gleamed with polished marble floors and fresh floral arrangements. From the parlor just down the hall, I heard the polite clinking of china cups and the low melodic murmur of wealthy women discussing upcoming charity galas. My mother was hosting her country club planning committee. Her eyes darted from my mud-stained boots to the crying babies, and the color drained from her cheeks. She did not reach out to help me hold the heavy seats. She did not ask how I was doing. Instead, sheer panic settled into her posture. Harper chose that exact moment to spit up sour milk down the front of her onesie. Noah screamed louder, his cries echoing against the vaulted ceiling of the foyer. Hazel, my mother hissed, glancing nervously over her shoulder toward the parlor entrance. "What are you doing here? I need help, Mom," I said, my voice trembling. "I have to go back to the car for Liam." She stepped out onto the porch and grabbed my arm. She did not pull me into the warmth of the house. She steered me down the side path, her grip tight enough to leave bruises on my bicep. "Take them through the side gate," she ordered, pushing me forward. "Go around to the caterer's kitchen. I will meet you there. Do not let anyone see you." I stumbled down the wet stone path, my arms burning under the weight of the carriers. I left Noah and Harper on the cold tile floor of the secondary kitchen and ran back through the freezing rain for Liam. By the time I returned, soaked and shivering, my father had joined my mother in the back of the house. The caterer's kitchen was sterile, wrapped in stainless steel, and smelled of dark espresso. My father stood near the center island, wearing his expensive golf attire, looking down at the 3 crying infants on the floor, as if a delivery driver had dropped off a package he had not ordered. I stood near the door, dripping rainwater onto the pristine tile. "The apartment is gone," I said, my voice cracking. "The landlord posted the notice today. We have nowhere to go. I just need the guest room above the garage. Just for a month. I will keep them quiet. I will find a job." I will stay out of your way. My mother looked toward the swinging door that led to the main house. Hazel, please lower your voice. The planning committee for the summer gala is sitting 20 feet away. If they hear this commotion, they will ask questions. I stared at her. The woman who had given birth to me was more concerned about her social standing than her homeless grandchildren sitting on a cold floor. Mom, I am begging you. I have nothing left. My father stepped forward. He sighed the heavy burdened sigh of a man dealing with an incompetent employee who had failed to meet a quota. We discussed this at the church, Hazel. We gave you an out, and you refused to take it. You chose to walk away. I walked away because you told me to give my babies to strangers. I said, the anger finally flaring through my deep exhaustion. He held up a hand to silence me. We cannot disrupt this household. I am closing a major commercial real estate deal this week. Your mother has her social obligations. 3 screaming infants do not fit into our current phase of life. But you have the space, I pleaded, gesturing toward the windows that face the detached garage. The apartment up there is empty. You do not even use it. My father leaned against the marble counter, his face hardening into a mask of pure business. We spent 24 years investing in your future, Hazel. We paid for the best schools. We gave you every advantage. We will not let your bad luck bankrupt our retirement. The words hit me harder than the freezing rain outside. Bad luck. My husband dying was bad luck. My children were a bad investment. The ledger was closed and my balance was in the red. My mother reached into the pocket of her tailored slacks. She pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was the same check for $500 my father had written in the church vestibule, the one I had left sitting on a wooden pew. She pressed it into my damp hand. Take this, she said, her voice dropping into a fake soothing tone designed to end the conversation. Go find a cheap motel for the week. Look into the state assistance programs. We love you, Hazel, but you have to learn how to stand on your own 2 feet. She placed her hand flat on my back and physically guided me toward the rear exit. My father picked up Liam's car seat. They ushered me out the back door carrying their own grandchild like unwanted baggage, depositing us swiftly onto the wet concrete of the driveway. The heavy service door clicked shut behind me. The deadbolt slid into place with a sharp metallic snap. I stood in the driveway, the rain washing over my face, holding the folded check. The paper grew soggy against my palm. I loaded the babies back into the rusted Subaru one by one. They were crying so hard their small faces were bright red. I climbed into the driver's seat and locked the doors. The cold air blew through the broken vents. I looked at the piece of paper in my hand. $500. It was the exact price tag they had placed on my dignity, my children, and my survival. They believed they could buy a clean conscience. I realized then that their love had never been real. It had always been a transaction contingent on my ability to make them look good. The moment my life became messy, the moment I stopped being a trophy they could brag about at the country club, I ceased to be their daughter. My hands shook. I gripped the edges of the wet check and tore it straight down the middle. I stacked the halves and tore them again. I rolled down the car window and let the wind pull the shredded pieces out into the storm. I watched the tiny white fragments scatter across the wet asphalt, disappearing into the dark puddles. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine groaned, sputtered, and finally caught. The fuel light glowed bright orange on the dashboard. I had a quarter tank of gas. I had 3 starving, exhausted babies in the back seat. The Oregon sun began to set behind the tall pine trees, casting long, dark shadows across the windshield. Night was falling fast, and the temperature was dropping near freezing. I gripped the steering wheel, staring out at the darkening road, and a terrifying new reality settled over me. Where do 4 homeless people sleep tonight? The fuel gauge hovered near the empty line as I steered the Subaru south, leaving the manicured glow of Lake Oswego behind. The streetlights faded, replaced by the heavy, wet darkness of the Willamette Valley. Here, the smooth pavement cracked and surrendered to rough gravel. The rain felt different out in the country, less like an inconvenience and more like a ruling force that governed the land. I took the final turn onto a rutted dirt road bordered by skeletal, untended grapevines. At the end of the long drive sat a weathered farmhouse. The front porch sagged on one side, and the white paint peeled in long strips, exposing the gray wood underneath. This was the Lawson farm, 40 acres of failing soil and drowning roots. I cut the engine. The silence was thick, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of rain on the car roof and the exhausted whimpers from the back seat. I stumbled up the wooden steps and knocked on the screen door. The porch light flicked on, casting a yellow circle over the worn floorboards. The inner door opened. Nancy Lawson stood there in a faded flannel robe. She was a woman built from decades of early mornings and hard harvests, her hands calloused and her face lined with a quiet, enduring kind of grace. She looked at me, shivering on her porch in the freezing rain. She looked past my shoulder at the rusted car in the driveway holding her dead son's children. She did not ask why I was there. She did not ask what had happened in Portland or how long I intended to stay. She pushed the screen door open and pulled me into the warmth of the hallway. "Give them to me," she whispered. The farmhouse smelled of wood smoke and old coffee. Nancy moved with swift, silent purpose. Within 5 minutes, she had 3 glass bottles warming in a saucepan on the stove. She took Liam from my aching arms and began rocking him against her shoulder, humming a low tune that resonated deep in her chest. Bill Lawson emerged from the hallway, pulling a pair of denim overalls over his thermal shirt. He was a tall man who spoke very little, possessing the deep, rooted humility characteristic of the Pacific Northwest. He took one look at the situation, nodded to me, and walked straight out the back door toward the barn. He returned carrying planks of sanded pine and a heavy toolbox. While Nancy fed the babies, Bill cleared every piece of furniture out of his small ground-floor office. He carried his desk and filing cabinets into the hallway. He spent the next 3 hours measuring, cutting, and drilling wood. The whine of his power saw echoed through the quiet house. By midnight, he had constructed 3 sturdy makeshift cribs and lined them with soft quilts his grandmother had sewn. The contrast struck me like a physical blow. My wealthy parents had locked me out of an empty mansion to protect their social standing. My in-laws, drowning in debt, tore apart their own home in the middle of the night to build a sanctuary for my children. The babies finally slept. I lay on a narrow cot in the corner of the converted office, listening to their synchronized breathing. The house grew quiet, but the anxiety in my chest kept me awake. Early the next morning, before the sun rose, I walked into the kitchen for a glass of water. A stack of mail sat on the scarred oak table. The top envelope bore a bold red stamp from a regional agricultural bank. Notice of intent to foreclose. I recognized the legal phrasing immediately. I leafed through the stack of envelopes. Unpaid property taxes, overdue utility bills, and final warnings from equipment suppliers. The Lawsons were sinking. Wyatt had often mentioned his parents' financial struggles, explaining how the vineyard had suffered through years of bad weather and plunging crop yields. They had mortgaged everything to keep the land, and now the land was failing them. A wave of suffocating guilt washed over me. I had brought 3 extra mouths to feed into a house that could barely keep its lights on. My presence was accelerating the ruin of the only people who actually loved me. I could not be their anchor, dragging them down into the mud. I wrapped a wool blanket around my shoulders and walked out the back door into the pre-dawn chill. The rain had paused, leaving a thick fog rolling off the distant hills. I wandered into the old tractor barn, seeking a quiet place to think. The air inside smelled of motor oil, dry dust, and damp hay. In the back corner, covered by a blue plastic tarp, sat a wooden workbench Wyatt had used during his teenage years. I pulled the tarp back. A stack of leather-bound notebooks rested beside a rusted wrench. I opened the top notebook. The pages were filled with my husband's meticulous handwriting. They were viticulture journals. Wyatt had spent years studying the soil composition of this exact property. He had drawn detailed sketches of the vine structures and charted the varying pH levels of the dirt across different plots. He had documented the microclimates, the drainage patterns, and the specific grafting techniques required to revive the neglected plants. I turned page after page, reading his notes on rootstock resilience and canopy management. He had mapped out a complete plan to save the farm, a plan he had never lived to execute. I stood in the dim barn, tracing my fingers over his words. My parents had told me to stand on my own 2 feet. They had assumed I would collapse without their money. The bank assumed this farm was a lost cause, but the journal in my hands held a different truth. The roots were still alive deep underground, waiting for someone to tend them. I set the book down and looked around the barn walls. A pair of heavy iron pruning shears hung from a rusty nail near the door. I reached out and took them down. The metal was cold and heavy in my palm, a solid grounding weight. I walked back out of the barn and looked out over the 40 acres of tangled, overgrown grapevines stretching toward the horizon. The sky in the east began to turn a pale, bruised purple. I would not let the bank take this home. I would not be a charity case for Bill and Nancy to carry. I tightened my grip on the handles of the shears, stepped off the gravel driveway, and walked directly into the deep, wet mud of the fields. The first year stripped away everything I thought I knew about hard labor. I traded the climate-controlled comfort of my past for the unforgiving rhythm of the changing seasons. My mornings began long before the sun cleared the eastern ridge, usually in the blue dark before dawn. I strapped Noah, Liam, and Harper into a wide, sturdy wooden playpen positioned at the edge of the vine rows, safely nestled under the shade of an ancient oak tree. The smell of damp, turned earth became my permanent perfume, a scent that settled deep into the fibers of my clothes. My hands, once soft from a sheltered life in Portland, cracked and bled within the first month. Blisters formed across my palms, burst under the friction of wooden handles, and eventually hardened into thick, unyielding calluses. I spent hours on my knees in the cold mud, gripping the heavy iron pruning shears, cutting away the dead wood that choked the healthy plants. My back ached with a deep, throbbing pain that radiated into my bones by nightfall. But every time I stood up to stretch, wiping sweat and dirt from my forehead with the back of a soiled glove, I looked over at the playpen. 3 toddlers babbled through wooden blocks into the grass and learned to walk in the fresh Willamette Valley air. Bill and Nancy worked right beside me, silent and steady. They never complained about their aching joints or the brutal weather. They just kept moving forward, their quiet resilience anchoring my own fragile sanity. I studied Wyatt's journals by the dim light of the kitchen stove every night after the children fell asleep. His handwritten notes detailed a meticulous agricultural process called grafting. Reading his words felt like holding a conversation with a ghost, his voice guiding my hands from the pages. I learned how to take a delicate fruit-bearing scion and bind it to a tough established rootstock. The local soil harbored pests and diseases that would easily kill a fragile vine left on its own. The only way the plant could survive was to cut a clean, precise notch into a hardy native root. Insert the vulnerable branch and wrap the wound tight until the 2 pieces fused together into a single living organism. The strong root system bled its own sap into the new wood, keeping the fragile branch alive until it could bear fruit on its own. I knelt in the dirt on a rainy Tuesday in early spring, binding a fresh Pinot Noir scion to an old, weathered stump. The green grafting tape slipped in my muddy fingers. As I pressed the 2 pieces of wood together, the living metaphor hit me so hard I had to pause and catch my breath. Bill and Nancy were the tough native roots. They had been planted in this valley for generations, weathering economic storms, terrible droughts, and the heartbreaking loss of their only son. My babies and I were the fragile branches severed from our old life and entirely incapable of surviving on our own. Bill and Nancy had let us graft ourselves onto their strength. They were bleeding their own limited financial resources to keep us fed and sheltered. I vowed right then, kneeling in the wet soil, to make sure the impending harvest would be worth their immense sacrifice. By the second winter, we faced a brutal cold snap. The temperature plummeted unexpectedly in late April, bringing a silent, lethal frost that threatened to freeze the sap inside the budding vines and destroy the entire crop. We stayed awake for 3 consecutive nights. Bill, Nancy, and I hauled heavy propane heaters into the fields, lighting warming fires at the end of every row. Smoke stung my eyes and my lungs burned from inhaling the freezing air. We walked the rows until dawn, our boots crunching over the frozen grass, checking the thermometer readings by flashlight, fighting the bitter winter chill for every single grape. The physical exhaustion blurred the edges of my vision, making the shadows dance between the vines, but the fear of losing the land kept my legs moving. During those desperate nights, pacing between the smoking heaters to stay warm, I remembered a specific topographical map Wyatt had drawn in his third journal. He had tracked the wind patterns and elevation changes of our south-facing slope. He discovered a unique microclimate trapped between two rolling hills where the soil drained much faster and the afternoon sun lingered an hour longer than anywhere else in the county. Wyatt believed this specific plot could support a notoriously difficult, rare clone of Pinot Noir. This particular grape commanded premium prices from high-end wineries across the state, but it required exact growing conditions to thrive. I convinced Bill to let me pull up a section of failing plants and pivot our entire strategy to this rare clone. It was a terrifying gamble for a family already on the brink of ruin. If the new vines failed, the farm would go bankrupt immediately. I planted the new grafts by hand, pressing the rich volcanic dirt around their bases, pouring every ounce of my desperate hope into the soil. I watered them, pruned away the competing leaves, and watched them grow with a fierce protective obsession. The third year brought a summer of perfect, gentle heat. The vines grew thick and green, their broad leaves soaking up the golden afternoon light. As September approached, the clusters of Pinot Noir grapes swelled, turning a deep, vibrant purple. They hung heavy on the branches, dusted with a pale natural yeast that signaled they were finally ready. The harvest morning felt like a sacred event. We worked from sunrise to sunset, clipping the heavy clusters and dropping them into yellow plastic bins. The sheer volume of the yield was astonishing. Sticky juice stained my fingers, dark red drawing bees that hummed through the crisp autumn air, and the sweet, earthy scent of ripe fruit filled the entire valley. Local vintners drove their trucks up our gravel driveway, eager to inspect the fruit. They tasted the grapes right off the vine, noting the complex balance of acid and sugar, the distinct flavor profile created by our unique microclimate. The buyers started bidding against each other right there in the dirt, raising their offers as they realized the quality of the yield. By the end of the week, we had sold the entire crop to a prestigious boutique winery in the Dundee Hills. The check they handed me was enough to clear the lingering equipment debts and pay back the overdue property taxes. For the first time in 3 years, I felt a genuine smile break across my tired face. I ran up the dirt path toward the farmhouse, clutching the paper, eager to show Nancy the deposit slip. The toddlers were chasing a barn cat near the porch steps, their laughter ringing out loud and clear. Noah tumbled into the tall grass, giggling, while Harper tried to pull him back onto his feet. I pulled open the screen door, my heavy boots thudding against the worn wooden floorboards. I called out to Nancy, holding the check high in the air, ready to celebrate our hard-won victory. Nancy was sitting at the kitchen table. The house felt far too quiet. The joy drained from my chest as I walked closer, noticing her rigid posture. She was staring down at a thick, cream-colored envelope featuring a certified mail sticker across the top edge. The bank logo was printed in the upper left corner in stark black ink. She did not look up when I entered the room. Her shoulders slumped forward, carrying a crushing weight that the harvest money could not possibly lift. I reached out and took the letter from her trembling hands. The text on the page was cold, formal, and devastating. The bank was demanding the entire remaining balance of the primary mortgage due in 30 days, or they would initiate final foreclosure proceedings. The money we had just earned, the reward for 3 years of bleeding hands and sleepless nights, was only a fraction of what they required to stop the seizure. The farm was still drowning, and the freezing water had just reached our chins. 4 years had passed since the night I stood shivering in my parents' driveway with 3 infants and a torn check. While my hands grew thick with calluses and my children learned to run through the vine rows, my parents continued to inhabit a world insulated by polished marble and imported silk. The annual Portland Pediatric Hospital Charity Gala took place in a downtown ballroom dripping with crystal chandeliers. Martin and Helen attended, wearing their philanthropy like a tailored garment. Waiters in black vests circulated with silver trays of champagne. My parents mingled near the silent auction tables, projecting an aura of effortless success. They greeted their wealthy peers with bright, polished smiles, seamlessly blending into the elite social fabric of the city. A woman named Victoria approached them, her wrists heavy with platinum tennis bracelets. She asked about me. She asked how the triplets were doing. Helen did not flinch. She took a delicate sip from her crystal flute and smiled a practiced, sorrowful smile. Hazel is finding herself, my mother said. We realized early on that shielding her from reality would only stunt her growth. We gave her the space to grow independently. It is tough love, but it built her character. Martin placed a steady, reassuring hand on my mother's waist. He shook his head with the weary grace of a patriarch carrying a heavy burden. Sometimes you have to let them fall so they learn how to stand, he added. They were weaponizing polite society. By framing their abandonment as a calculated parenting strategy, they shielded their reputation from scrutiny. They were claiming credit for the resilience they had forced upon me. They transformed my brutal survival into a testament to their own wisdom. They had thrown me into the deep end to drown, and now they were taking a bow because I had learned how to swim. While my mother collected sympathetic nods in a climate-controlled ballroom, I sat across a scarred wooden desk in a rural agricultural bank. The foreclosure notice rested between me and a loan officer named David. David scrutinized the ledgers I had brought him. I had compiled 3 years of meticulous data based on Wyatt's journals. I showed him the exceptional yield from our first successful harvest of the rare Pinot Noir clone. I presented the purchase orders from the local vintners. I laid out a projected growth model proving the farm could generate sustainable high-margin revenue if we expanded our operation. David leaned back in his creaking leather chair. He explained that the Lawsons were too far gone in arrears to qualify for any further restructuring. Their credit was ruined beyond repair. The only way to save the 40 acres was for someone else to assume the risk and buy the debt outright. I did not hesitate. I asked him to draft the paperwork in my name. David warned me about the stakes. It was a staggering sum. I was asking for a high-risk commercial agricultural loan requiring the land and the future harvests as collateral. If a late frost killed the vines, or if a blight swept through the valley, I would be held personally liable for a debt that would bankrupt me for the rest of my life. I thought about Bill building cribs in the middle of the night. I thought about Nancy warming bottles while her own heart was breaking over the loss of her son. They had tethered themselves to my sinking ship when I had nothing to offer them. I picked up the black pen. I signed my full name on the dotted line. The dull thud of the notary stamp echoed in the small office. With that single signature, I absorbed their financial ruin and made it my own. I officially tethered my life, my future, and my children's security to the dark volcanic soil of the Willamette Valley. The farm was no longer just a refuge, it was my responsibility. The ensuing months demanded a relentless, punishing focus. We officially named the estate Lawson's Graft, a tribute to the resilient rootstock that had kept us alive. We stopped selling our grapes to other winemakers and began bottling the wine ourselves. We converted the old tractor barn into a temperature-controlled production facility. I learned the delicate chemistry of fermentation, the precise timing of the crush, and the agonizing patience required for barrel aging. When we released our first independent vintage, I drove a case of it to a prestigious regional wine competition in Seattle. I felt like an imposter walking among generational vineyard owners and corporate distributors. Our bottles featured simple hand-drawn labels. We did not have a marketing budget or a public relations team. We only had the liquid inside the glass. The judges conducted their tastings blind. When the results were posted on a heavy corkboard in the main exhibition hall, I had to read the print 3 times to ensure my eyes were not deceiving me. Lawson's Graft had won the gold medal for the Pinot Noir category. The tasting notes described our vintage as a revelation. The critics praised the complex, earthy undertones and the vibrant, balanced acidity, attributing the unique flavor profile to our specific microclimate. Word spread rapidly through the tight-knit Pacific Northwest culinary community. Premium restaurants in Portland and Seattle began placing wholesale orders. Specialty wine shops requested exclusive distribution rights. The inventory from our first bottling sold out in less than 3 weeks. We were no longer a failing farm fighting foreclosure. We were a profitable, highly sought-after boutique brand. The money began to flow inward steady and reliable, allowing us to upgrade our equipment and establish a robust college fund for Noah, Liam, and Harper. The success of Lawson's Graft caught the attention of the regional press. A prominent business journal dispatched a journalist and a photographer to our property. They spent 2 days shadowing me through the vine rows, interviewing Bill and Nancy, and taking pictures of the triplets running through the tall grass. 2 weeks later, the glossy magazine hit newsstands across the state. 70 miles away, in the quiet, sterile luxury of his private office, my father sat behind a polished mahogany desk. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the expensive artwork on his walls. He poured himself a cup of imported coffee and unrolled the freshly delivered business journal. He flipped past the real estate summaries and the stock market analyses. He turned the page and stopped. A full-page color photograph stared back at him. It was a picture of me standing in the muddy fields at dawn. My hands were stained dark with grape juice. My hair was tied back in a messy knot, and I was holding a cluster of deep purple fruit. The headline above the photograph read, "From Ruin to Revenue, the Rising Star of the Willamette Valley." My father set his coffee cup down. The liquid sloshed over the rim, staining a clean white coaster. He leaned forward, gripping the edges of the magazine. He read the article line by line. He read about the devastating loss of my husband. He read about my transition into viticulture. But most importantly, his eyes locked onto the financial figures printed in bold black ink. The journalist had estimated the current market value of Lawson's Graft and detailed the explosive revenue growth of our award-winning vintage. The numbers were extraordinary. The failing plot of dirt he had dismissed as a tragedy had blossomed into a highly lucrative enterprise. My father traced his finger over the glossy image of my face. The daughter he had deemed a financial liability, the young mother he had locked out in the freezing rain to protect his retirement portfolio, was now commanding millions of dollars in the private sector. I did not feel remorse for abandoning me. He did not feel pride in my resilience. As he read the staggering profit margins attached to my name, a dark, calculating realization washed over his features. He saw an untapped asset. He recognized the immense financial potential of the child he had discarded, and the gears of his opportunism began to turn. 5 years is a long time to spend with your hands in the dirt. At 29, my skin carried the permanent weathered texture of the vines I tended. Noah, Liam, and Harper were 5 years old, a whirlwind of scuffed knees, muddy boots, and tangled hair. They knew the exact difference between a dormant root and a budding branch. They chased the barn cats through the tall grass and ate meals at a scarred oak table surrounded by the only grandparents who had ever chosen them. Lawson's Graft was no longer a desperate experiment. It was a thriving, highly profitable enterprise. We had expanded our production facility, hired a dedicated local crew, and built a modest tasting room overlooking the valley. Our Pinot Noir had secured a waiting list spanning 3 states, and the rural agricultural loan I had signed in a panic was paid off in full. The nights of sitting awake by propane heaters fearing bankruptcy were gone, replaced by a steady humming prosperity. The disruption to our hard-won peace arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in the form of a sleek black luxury sedan. It navigated the rutted gravel of our long driveway, looking distinctly out of place against the backdrop of our rustic barn and rusting farm equipment. A man stepped out into the crisp Oregon air. He wore a tailored navy suit and expensive leather shoes that hesitated before stepping onto the damp soil. He introduced himself as Gregory Tate, a senior acquisitions director for a global beverage conglomerate based in London. I invited him into the farmhouse. Bill and Nancy sat at the kitchen table, their hands wrapped around warm mugs of coffee, watching the corporate stranger with the quiet, skeptical caution native to Pacific Northwest farmers. Gregory opened a slim leather briefcase and withdrew a glossy bound prospectus. He spoke with a polished cadence, using terms like market penetration, brand synergy, and global distribution scaling. His conglomerate wanted to buy Lawson's Graft. They wanted the brand name, the production facility, the proprietary grafting techniques, and the 40 acres of unique volcanic soil. Gregory slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It contained their initial offer, $80 million. Bill let out a low, ragged breath. Nancy closed her eyes, her hand trembling slightly against her coffee mug. To people who had spent their entire lives agonizing over the price of tractor parts and property taxes, $80 million was an incomprehensible sum. It was enough to secure their lineage for generations. Gregory smiled, a practiced, easy expression designed to close a deal. He leaned back in his chair, waiting for the inevitable gratitude, the tears of relief, the immediate signature. I looked at the number printed on the heavy cardstock. I did not smile. I did not reach for a pen. Sitting across from that tailored suit, I felt a familiar icy calm wash over me. I remembered standing in a wood-paneled church vestibule. I remembered my father checking his gold watch, telling me to strip the emotion from the situation, looking at my grieving family as nothing more than a bad investment. My father had taught me a brutal lesson that day about the mechanics of power. He had taught me that sentiment is a vulnerability in a negotiation, and that the person who cares the least holds the most leverage. I channeled every ounce of that cold, calculating cruelty. I stripped the emotion from the kitchen table. "Mr. Tate," I said, keeping my voice in a low-level register. "Your offer evaluates our current production volume and the baseline value of the acreage. It does not account for the proprietary nature of the microclimate that produces our specific clone. It does not factor in the customer retention rate of our waiting list, which currently sits at 94%. Gregory shifted in his chair. His smile faltered just a fraction. "Ms. Kingsley, $80 million is a highly competitive market valuation for a boutique operation of this size. It is a very generous entry point." I pushed the paper back across the table. "I do not need a generous entry point," I said. "We own the land outright. We carry zero debt. We are operating at a profit margin your conglomerate has not seen in its boutique division in a decade. You are not buying a farm today. You are attempting to buy a monopoly on the highest-rated Pinot Noir in the Pacific Northwest." I leaned forward, resting my calloused hands on the table. "My asking price is $150 million. Bill coughed, a sudden sharp sound. Gregory stared at me, his polished veneer cracking to reveal genuine shock. "That is an unprecedented figure for this region," he said, his voice tightening. "My board will never authorize nearly double the initial valuation." "Then you should pack up your briefcase," I replied, standing up from my chair. "We have vines to prune before the sun goes down. Thank you for making the drive." I turned my back on him and walked toward the kitchen sink. The silence in the room stretched thick and heavy. I heard the rustle of paper, the click of the briefcase latch closing, and then a long, defeated exhale. "Wait," Gregory said. I stopped, turning my head slightly. "If we meet that figure," he said, the words tasting sour in his mouth, "the non-compete clauses and the transition requirements will be rigorous. We will need you to stay on for 2 years as a consulting director." "Draw up the paperwork," I said. "We can review it on Friday." The conglomerate moved with terrifying speed. Within a week, a small army of corporate attorneys descended upon our local bank to facilitate the transaction. But before the final ink dried on the acquisition, I drove into town to a modest brick building on Main Street. I sat down with a sharp, no-nonsense estate attorney named Elaine. She had drafted the initial agricultural loan that saved the farm, and she knew the Lawson family history. Elaine assumed I wanted to set up standard wealth management accounts for the incoming capital. She pulled out a stack of standard tax strategy forms. I shook my head. "I do not want the funds deposited into my personal accounts," I told her. "I need you to draft a highly specific, irrevocable trust." Elaine lowered her pen. She looked at me over the rim of her reading glasses. "Hazel, once you lock funds into an irrevocable trust, you forfeit direct ownership. You cannot alter the terms, and you cannot dissolve it without complex legal proceedings. It is a permanent firewall." "That is exactly what I want," I said. "I want a permanent firewall." I spent the next 2 hours outlining the precise architecture of the trust. Every single dollar of the $150 million payout, along with the retained equity in the farmhouse itself, would flow directly into this protected entity. I structured it so the financial control bypassed me entirely. I was building a fortress, ensuring that no one could ever leverage my wealth, lay claim to my assets, or threaten the security of the people who had kept me breathing. Elaine finalized the trust documents, her expression, a mix of professional caution and deep respect. We filed the paperwork with the county clerk on a Thursday afternoon. The legal trap was set, bound by ironclad statutes and notarized signatures. The official public announcement of the acquisition was scheduled for the upcoming Harvest Gala. However, corporate secrets rarely survive in a small industry. Early Friday morning, a prominent regional financial news outlet caught wind of the transaction. A business reporter published a digital exclusive. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter while I was packing lunches for the triplets. I opened the screen. The headline blared in stark black text across the digital page: Beverage giant acquires Willamette Valley Boutique Winery in record-breaking $150 million deal. The article detailed my name, the staggering payout, and the timeline of the upcoming gala. I stared at the screen, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. The bait was in the water. The blood was in the current. 2 hours north, in a pristine mansion in Lake Oswego, the news was spreading. The people who had locked me out in the rain were about to realize just how much equity they had thrown away, and I knew exactly what they would do next. The morning fog had barely lifted off the valley floor when the crunch of tires on gravel broke the quiet rhythm of the farm. I was standing near the loading dock of the converted tractor barn, logging inventory on a clipboard, while a small crew of seasonal workers secured pallets of wine bottles into the back of a delivery truck. The air was crisp, carrying the sharp scent of crushed pine needles and damp earth. A vehicle turned off the main county road and began the long, slow drive up our property line. It was not a delivery truck or a local supplier. It was a brand new silver Mercedes sedan. The sleek, polished chassis looked absurd against the backdrop of rusted wire fences and muddy irrigation ditches. The car rolled to a smooth stop near the front porch of the farmhouse. The engine cut off and the heavy doors swung open with a muted, expensive thud. Martin and Helen stepped out into the crisp autumn air. 5 years had passed since the night they locked me out in the freezing rain, yet they looked exactly the same. They wore immaculate wool coats and pristine leather designer boots that hesitated before touching the damp, uneven gravel of our driveway. My mother adjusted her silk scarf, her eyes scanning the weathered wood of the farmhouse exterior with undisguised distaste. My father buttoned his suit jacket, projecting the same authoritative posture he used to dominate boardroom negotiations in Portland. They did not come empty-handed. They carried large, brightly wrapped boxes adorned with oversized satin bows. The gifts were staggering in their audacity. My father held a highly complex motorized racing drone intended for teenagers, while my mother carried 2 enormous fragile porcelain dolls dressed in Victorian lace. Noah, Liam, and Harper were 5 years old. They spent their days digging for earthworms in the mud and chasing stray barn cats through the vine rows. The items my parents carried were not gifts for active rural children. They were expensive, thoughtless props purchased hastily from a high-end boutique to serve a singular purpose. They were bribes. I set my clipboard down on a wooden crate. My pulse spiked, a sudden surge of adrenaline flooding my veins, but I forced my breathing to slow. I channeled the cold, clinical detachment I had learned during those desperate nights of pruning frozen vines. I walked away from the loading dock and headed toward the farmhouse, my muddy boots padding softly against the damp soil. Nancy stood on the front porch. She had stepped out of the kitchen holding a faded dish towel, her posture instantly transforming from a weary grandmother into a furious, immovable guardian. She knew exactly who these people were. She remembered the state I was in when I arrived on her doorstep, shaking and penniless, carrying her 3 infant grandchildren. Nancy did not speak. She simply stood at the top of the wooden steps, her jaw set, blocking the entrance to the home she had torn apart to build us a sanctuary. My mother spotted me approaching from the barn. She immediately noticed the 3 vineyard workers pausing their task to watch the strange vehicle. The presence of an audience triggered her instinct to perform. Helen dropped her posture of distaste and threw her arms wide open, her face contorting into an expression of profound, tearful relief. "Hazel!" My mother cried out, her voice carrying across the gravel driveway. "Oh, look at you! We have missed you so much, darling." She moved forward, The porcelain dolls clutched awkwardly against her chest, preparing to stage a dramatic emotional reunion for the benefit of the watching crew. She expected me to crumble. She expected the prodigal daughter to weep and fall into her embrace, erasing 5 years of abandonment in a single convenient moment. I did not run to her. I did not raise my voice. I intercepted them at the base of the porch steps, placing myself squarely between their expensive boots and Nancy. "Keep your voice down," I said, maintaining a steady, even indoor tone. "The children are sleeping inside." My mother halted her arms, dropping awkwardly to her sides. The tears vanished from her eyes, replaced by a flicker of genuine irritation at having her performance interrupted. She recovered quickly, holding out the fragile lace-covered dolls. "We brought gifts for the babies," she said, her smile tight and unnatural. "We read the wonderful news this morning. We are just so incredibly proud of everything you have built here. We knew you had it in you all along." The sheer audacity of the revisionist history hung in the crisp morning air. She was standing on the very dirt I had bled into holding inappropriate gifts for grandchildren. She had advised me to give away, attempting to claim a share of the victory she had actively tried to prevent. I reached out and calmly took the large, cumbersome boxes from their hands. I did not thank them. I stacked the drone and the porcelain dolls on the bottom step of the porch right at my feet, creating a physical barrier. "You cannot come inside," I said, looking directly into my mother's eyes. Helen blinked, her polite facade cracking. "Hazel, please. We drove all the way from Portland to celebrate with you. We are your family. You cannot just leave us standing in the driveway." I leaned forward, my voice remaining soft, but carrying the sharp, unyielding edge of a scalpel. "You stood in a warm kitchen and watched me walk out into a storm with 3 starving infants," I said. "I can leave you standing wherever I choose." My father realized the emotional manipulation tactic had failed. The audience of seasonal workers had already gone back to loading the truck, uninterested in the quiet exchange happening by the porch. With the spectators gone, Martin dropped the affectionate patriarch act entirely. His posture straightened, and the cold, calculating businessman returned to the surface. He stepped past my mother, closing the distance between us. "Let us drop the pleasantries," he said, his voice reverting to the low, flat murmur he had used in the church vestibule 5 years ago. "I read the financial journals this morning. I know about the impending acquisition. You are about to absorb a staggering amount of liquid capital." I kept my hands loose at my sides, refusing to flinch. "I am well aware of the transaction details," I replied. "You are a farmer, Hazel," he stated, emphasizing the word as if it were a defect. "You know how to grow fruit. You do not know how to manage a 9-figure corporate payout. Wealth of that magnitude requires sophisticated asset management. It requires offshore structuring, tax shelters, and strategic reinvestment portfolios. If you try to handle this alone, the federal government will tax you into oblivion, and you will lose everything you have worked for." I was trying to instill panic. He was using his financial expertise as a weapon, assuming I was still the terrified, desperate girl who had begged for a room above his garage. He believed that the sheer scale of the money would frighten me back into his control. "We need to have a formal family business meeting," my father continued, projecting calm authority. "We need to sit down with my wealth management team in Portland and discuss how to protect these assets. We can structure a joint entity. It is the only practical way forward." I looked at the man who had called me a liability. He was now eagerly offering to manage the very same portfolio he had refused to fund. He wanted control of the money, and he was using the guise of paternal protection to gain access to the accounts. I could have rejected him right then. I could have ordered him off the property and told him to never return. But a sudden, crystal-clear strategy formed in my mind. Rejecting him in my driveway would simply send him away angry. He would spend the next year filing frivolous lawsuits, attempting to claim grandparent rights, or fabricating claims that he had provided the initial seed money for the vineyard. He needed to be dismantled completely, and he needed to be dismantled in an arena where he could not hide behind closed doors. I looked past him, glancing at the sleek silver car parked in my gravel driveway. "I will not meet with your wealth management team," I said, my voice smooth and agreeable. "But I will sit down and discuss the financial restructuring with you and Mom." Helen perked up, a triumphant gleam flashing in her eyes. "Oh, darling, that is so sensible of you," she said, her fake warmth returning instantly. We can meet next week, I continued. In Portland, at a public restaurant of your choosing. We will have lunch and you can present your investment strategy. My father nodded, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across his face. He believed he had won. He believed I had folded under the pressure of his financial intimidation. Perfect, he said. I will have my assistant book a private table at the club. No, I corrected him softly. Not the country club, a public restaurant, somewhere downtown. I will bring the current ledger, and we can discuss the transition. My parents agreed, eagerly blind to the boundary I had just drawn around them. They turned back toward their expensive sedan, their designer boots crunching lightly against the gravel. They got inside the engine, purring to life, and the vehicle slowly rolled back down the rutted driveway toward the county road. I stood by the wooden porch steps looking down at the ridiculous porcelain dolls and the motorized racing drone. Nancy walked down the steps behind me. She placed a warm, calloused hand on my shoulder, watching the silver car disappear into the morning mist. You are going to see them? She asked, her voice tight with protective concern. I picked up the heavy boxes from the mud. Yes, I said. I am going to see them. I carried the useless bribes toward the outdoor trash bins. My parents had asked for a business meeting in polite society, assuming they could dictate the terms of my future over a white tablecloth. They were setting a table in Portland, but they had no idea I was bringing the receipts. The restaurant was called The Sovereign. It occupied the top floor of a gleaming glass high-rise in downtown Portland, a place where reservations were secured months in advance and the menus lacked printed prices. The private elevator doors glided open, revealing a muted atmosphere of dark mahogany, brushed brass, and the low, steady hum of generational wealth. I handed my coat to a silent attendant. I wore a tailored charcoal blazer and a simple silver watch. I did not attempt to match the imported silk surrounding me, nor did I look like the desperate girl who had once begged for shelter in a freezing driveway. I looked like a woman who carried the weight of her own acres. The hostess led me past the main dining room toward a secluded alcove enclosed by frosted glass partitions. I rounded the corner, expecting to find a quiet table set for 3. I expected my father checking his phone and my mother judging the stemware. Instead, I found a table set for 8. My mother sat near the center, radiant in emerald green holding court with a crystalline smile. Beside her sat my father, flanked by my Aunt Sylvia, my Uncle Arthur, and 2 older cousins I had not seen since a distant summer barbecue during my high school years. My feet stopped moving for a fraction of a second. This was not a negotiation. It was an ambush. My mother stood immediately, her arms wide, projecting maternal joy. She kissed the air near my cheek, a gesture meant for the audience rather than for me. She guided me to the empty chair directly across from my father, positioning me at the focal point of the gathering. The relatives beamed at me. I remembered Aunt Sylvia as a woman who used to send me modest birthday cards until I left for college, and Uncle Arthur as a man whose local logistics business perpetually hovered on the edge of bankruptcy. They looked at me now with a strange, reverent hunger. They did not know the truth of my survival. They only knew the polished, manufactured narrative Helen had sold them over country club luncheons and holiday dinners. Over plates of seared scallops and truffled risotto. My mother orchestrated the psychological warfare. She did not apologize. She did not ask about the grueling years I spent pruning vines in the cold mud. Instead, she painted herself as a visionary architect of my success. It broke our hearts, Helen told the table, dabbing the corner of her mouth with a stark white linen napkin. When Wyatt passed away, Martin and I stayed awake for nights, sick with worry about Hazel and the babies. It was the hardest decision we ever made as parents. Aunt Sylvia leaned in, her eyes wide with sympathetic attention. What did you do, Helen? We realized that if we gave her a handout, she would never discover her own strength, my mother explained, her voice dripping with practiced sorrow. We had to give her the space to grow independently. We knew the potential she possessed. It was tough love, and it was agonizing for us to watch, but we stood back because we knew it would build her character. Look at what she accomplished. We always knew she had it in her. My father nodded solemnly, taking a slow sip of his bourbon. Sometimes a parent must bear the burden of being the villain so the child can become the hero, he said, his tone thick with false wisdom. I sat quietly at the end of the table. I sliced a scallop with the edge of my silver fork. I chewed, I swallowed. I did not raise my voice, and I did not correct their delusion. My silence was not submission. It was a calculated observation. I watched my extended family murmur in profound admiration at my mother's supposed sacrifice. My mother was laying the emotional groundwork, establishing a fictional debt of gratitude, framing my upcoming financial windfall as the direct result of their brilliant parenting strategy. The waiter cleared our plates and poured fresh wine. The conversation shifted toward the impending acquisition. The news of the corporate buyout had clearly circulated through the family grapevine. My cousins asked invasive questions about the beverage conglomerate, their eyes gleaming with unchecked curiosity. Then came the pebble that nearly cracked my composure. Aunt Sylvia swirled her Pinot Noir, gazing at me with an expression of performative pity. "It really is a testament to your upbringing, Hazel," she said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "And honestly, it is just such a shame about those in-laws of yours, the Lawsons." I stopped moving. My breathing slowed. "What about them, Sylvia?" "Well, everyone heard how deeply in debt they were before you arrived," she said, sighing as if carrying a heavy burden. "It just breaks my heart to think of those people taking advantage of your hard work to save their failing little farm. They practically used you as a lifeline. To profit off a young widow like that, it is just terribly unfortunate." My fingers wrapped around the stem of my crystal wine glass. The thin, delicate glass pressed hard against the thick, rigid calluses on my palm. The Lawsons had given up their own bedroom. Bill had built cribs with his bare hands, while his heart shattered over the loss of his only son. Nancy had rocked my infants to sleep while I cried on her kitchen floor. They had bled their last dimes to keep me warm. The stem of the wine glass groaned under the pressure of my grip. I stared across the table at Mother, who offered a small, tragic nod of agreement to her sister. I did not throw the glass. I did not shout. I slowly relaxed my fingers, breathing through my nose, locking the anger deep inside a vault where they could not reach it. My father sensed the subtle shift in the air. He cleared his throat, signaling the end of the social theater and the beginning of the transaction. He reached down into his leather briefcase resting by his feet. He placed a thick, cream-colored envelope on the white tablecloth. He pushed it across the smooth surface, letting it come to a rest inches from my plate. "Now that the emotional, heavy lifting is behind us, Hazel, we need to discuss the practical reality of this transition," my father said, his voice returning to the crisp, authoritative cadence of a corporate dealmaker. "The capital you are about to receive is monumental. Unmanaged wealth of that scale is a target for predatory taxation and poor investments." I looked down at the envelope. "What is this?" "It is the structural blueprint for the Kingsley Family Investment Fund," he replied, folding his hands together. "I have spoken with my primary wealth management team. We have drafted a legal framework that will protect the assets and ensure generational stability." He leaned forward, holding my gaze, attempting to project the illusion of control. "I will serve as the primary managing director of the trust. It will shield you from the daily administrative burdens and the complex federal tax liabilities. We have allocated a specific sum for this protective entity." He did not blink when he dropped the number. "The fund will require an initial capitalization of $50 million. The entire table went dead silent. The cousins stopped breathing. Uncle Arthur stared at his water glass. $50 million. My father had locked me out in a freezing storm rather than spare a single room in his mansion, and now he was sitting in a luxury restaurant surrounded by witnesses. He had manipulated, calmly sliding a piece of paper across a table, asking me to hand him a third of my life's work. The thick envelope sat on the white linen tablecloth, bright and sharp under the recessed lighting of the private dining room. $50 million. My father kept his hands folded near his plate, his posture radiating the manufactured calm of a man who believed he had already secured a monumental victory. My mother watched me with bated breath, her emerald green dress catching the light as she waited for my inevitable display of gratitude. The extended family stared in silent awe, fully bought into the elaborate theater my parents had staged. They expected me to weep to thank my mother and father for their boundless wisdom and to sign away a third of my life as a token of my filial devotion. I did not flip the heavy table. I did not throw my expensive wine into my father's smug face. A younger, more fragile version of me might have screamed, demanding to know how they could sleep comfortably at night after abandoning a young widow and 3 starving infants in the freezing rain. But the woman sitting in that chair had weathered late spring frosts, fought off rural bank foreclosures, and negotiated with ruthless beverage executives. I knew that hot, fast anger was a cheap and useless currency. I reached out and picked up the thick cream-colored envelope. I did not open the flap to read the parasitic terms they had drafted. I simply folded the envelope in half, the heavy cardstock creasing, with a crisp, satisfying sound, and placed it carefully into my leather purse. The metallic clasp of my bag snapped shut, echoing sharply in the quiet alcove. I looked up, meeting my father's expectant gaze with a soft, perfectly calibrated smile. "I will announce the financial restructuring at the Harvest Gala next weekend," I said, keeping my voice even and pleasant. A collective exhale swept through the dining table. The intense tension evaporated, replaced instantly by the giddy, intoxicating rush of unearned wealth. My mother beamed, reaching for her wine glass to hide her triumphant smirk. My father nodded slowly, acting like a magnanimous ruler, accepting the inevitable tribute from a defeated subordinate. He believed he had successfully cornered me. They took my measured response as a total victory, assuming my silence was the quiet realization of my own incompetence and a grateful surrender to their financial superiority. I stood up from the table, smoothing the front of my charcoal blazer. I thanked them for the meal, wished my aunts and uncles a pleasant evening, and walked out of the restaurant before the dessert menus arrived. I left them to pay the check, stepping into the private elevator, while their celebratory laughter seeped through the frosted glass partitions. The long drive back to the Willamette Valley felt like descending from a sterile, oxygen-deprived atmosphere back to the rich, breathing earth. I navigated the winding highway out of Portland, watching the jagged glass skyline fade in my rearview mirror. The Oregon rain began to fall as I crossed the county line, washing away the lingering scent of expensive cologne and roasted scallops. My mind hummed with a cold, precise energy. My parents had orchestrated their ambush under the guise of familial duty, hoping to leverage polite society to extort me. They had spent years crafting a fictitious narrative, positioning themselves as the architects of my resilience. They wanted the world to believe they were the strong rootstock. They were about to discover the brutal reality of the pruning shears. Early the next morning, I drove into town and parked in front of a modest brick building. Elaine, the sharp, pragmatic estate attorney who had guided me through the initial corporate buyout contract, was waiting in her office. The room smelled of old paper and bitter coffee, a stark contrast to the hollow luxury of the restaurant the night before. I sat across from Elaine and placed my purse on her cluttered desk. I did not need to explain the emotional trauma of the ambush lunch. Elaine dealt in facts, deeds, and legal statutes. I laid out my exact requirements, speaking with the clinical detachment of a surgeon preparing an operating room. "We are executing the trust today," I told her. "I need the structure locked, sealed, and legally binding before the sun goes down." Elaine pulled a thick stack of documents from a manila folder. She adjusted her reading glasses, her expression settling into a mask of pure professional focus. She understood the gravity of the paperwork sitting between us. This was not a standard wealth management portfolio, it was an administrative execution. "We are establishing the Lawson Graft Irrevocable Trust," Elaine said, tapping a silver pen against the heavy bond paper. "Let us review the mechanics one final time, Hazel. Once these signatures are notarized and filed with the state, the terms are immutable. You are permanently transferring the ownership of the Vineyard estate, the production facilities, and the entirety of the pending $150 million corporate payout into this specific entity." I nodded, reading the bold text at the top of the first page. "By structuring this as an irrevocable entity, you are legally removing these assets from your direct personal estate." Elaine continued, tracing her pen along the primary clauses. "They can never be claimed by external relatives, challenged in a probate court by your parents, or attached to any future civil suits claiming familial entitlement." You are building an impenetrable wall. The moment the ink dries, that money ceases to belong to you as an individual. It belongs exclusively to the trust. She turned the page to the beneficiary designations. This was the most profound emotional conflict of the entire process, reduced to black ink and rigid legal terminology. I was formally severing my bloodline. I was instructing the law to recognize that the people who shared my DNA were strangers entitled to nothing, while the people who had taken me in when I was homeless were my true recognized family. The primary beneficiaries are listed as Noah Kingsley, Liam Kingsley, and Harper Kingsley. Elaine read aloud, her voice steady and clear in the quiet room. The secondary beneficiaries vested with immediate protective equity and lifetime security provisions are William Lawson and Nancy Lawson. I stared at the names printed on the crisp page. I thought about Bill spending his nights in the freezing mud to save a crop that did not belong to him. I thought about Nancy rocking my fatherless infants to sleep while her own farm faced imminent foreclosure. They had spent their lives working the tough soil, carrying the crushing weight of endless debt with quiet humility and deep, unwavering loyalty. They had stepped into the void my parents had created. And then I thought of my father sliding a demand for $50 million across a white tablecloth, and my mother collecting sympathy from her country club friends. For a tragedy, she refused to help me survive. "Are there any exclusions?" Elaine asked, looking up from the document. "Any specific individuals you wish to formally bar from accessing or challenging this trust?" "Yes," I said, my voice dropping to a low, hard whisper. "Add a specific disinheritance clause. Name Martin and Helen explicitly. I want it recorded in the county registry that they are legally excluded from every single cent now and forever. I want no ambiguity. They get zero." Elaine typed the addendum into her computer with rapid, forceful keystrokes. She printed the final pages and arranged them on the desk. She handed me the silver pen. The metal felt heavy and cold against my calloused fingers. I signed my name on 11 different signature lines, initialing the margins, legally binding my immense wealth to the people who had kept my children breathing. The notary applied her heavy stamp, the loud, definitive crunch of the embosser echoing in the small office, cementing the reality of my choices. The trap was set, the firewall was built. Elaine gathered the paperwork, sliding the documents into a thick leather folio. She let out a long, slow breath, taking off her reading glasses and looking at me with a mixture of awe and profound caution. "The transfer is complete," she said, leaning forward on her desk. "The money and the estate are secure. Your parents have zero legal standing, Hazel. They cannot touch you. But you mentioned you are making an announcement at the Harvest Gala this weekend." I nodded, picking up my purse. "I am." "The gala will be filled with corporate buyers, local politicians, and regional press," Elaine cautioned. "Your parents are going to be sitting in the front row expecting you to announce their investment fund. You are holding a loaded weapon, Hazel. Are you sure you want to do this publicly?" I stood up, pushing my chair back. The memory of my mother whispering her false narrative to her wealthy friends flashed brightly in my mind. "They wanted the credit in public," I said, walking toward the office door. "They can have the consequences there too." The conversion of the old tractor barn into a venue fit for a 9-figure corporate acquisition took less than 48 hours. A Portland event firm had draped the weathered wooden beams with cascading strings of warm amber lights, casting a golden glow over the concrete floor I used to scrub by hand. Long tables crafted from reclaimed oak stretched across the center of the room, lined with crystal wine glasses and centerpieces of wild thistle and dark purple grapes. The scent of roasted rosemary, cedar wood, and expensive catering masked the lingering smell of diesel and damp earth. It was a rustic, chic fantasy designed for people who had never actually pulled a weed or worried about a late spring frost. The parking lot, usually filled with rusted pickup trucks and flatbed trailers, now overflowed with black town cars and luxury sport utility vehicles. Local politicians seeking photo opportunities mingled near the entrance, their smiles wide and practiced. Prominent wine critics from regional lifestyle magazines took meticulous notes on small leather pads, swirling the Pinot Noir in their glasses and holding it up to the light. Gregory Tate, the acquisitions director from the beverage conglomerate, stood near the stage in his tailored navy suit, surrounded by a team of junior executives. They surveyed the crowd with the calculating satisfaction of conquerors, inspecting a newly acquired territory. The energy in the room hummed with anticipation, a vibrant, intoxicating rush of success and impending wealth. Waiters navigated the narrow spaces between the oak tables, balancing silver trays loaded with delicate hors d'oeuvres, while the low melodic sound of a string quartet floated through the cavernous space. Into this curated atmosphere walked my parents. They did not just arrive, they made an entrance. Martin and Helen swept through the double barn doors 45 minutes before the scheduled speeches, dressed to perfection. My mother wore a deep burgundy silk dress that matched the shade of our signature vintage, her neck draped in understated but undeniably expensive pearls. My father wore a sharp charcoal blazer over a crisp, open-collared shirt, achieving a flawless balance of casual affluence. They immediately began working the room, moving from cluster to cluster with predatory grace. They intercepted local journalists, extending warm handshakes and offering practiced, self-deprecating laughs. I watched from the shadow of the tall steel fermentation tanks as my mother laid a manicured hand on the arm of a prominent food critic. She projected her voice just loud enough to be overheard by the surrounding guests. She spoke about the early days of the vineyard, painting a fictional portrait of our tight-knit family working together to foster a dream. She spun a beautiful, seamless lie about recognizing my potential, about guiding my business acumen, and about the pride a parent feels when their child finally blossoms under their careful direction. My father flanked her, nodding sagely, accepting congratulations from the corporate executives as if he had personally pruned every vine on the property. They were staking their claim, planting their flag in the center of the room, loudly branding themselves as the proud parents of the founder. They were cementing the narrative in front of the press, ensuring that when the money changed hands, their names would be forever linked to the triumph. The contrast on the other side of the barn was sharp enough to draw blood. Near the loading dock doors, trying desperately to blend into the shadows, stood Bill and Nancy Lawson. They had put on their Sunday best for the occasion. Bill wore a stiff dark suit that he clearly reserved for funerals and church services, his broad shoulders looking constrained under the rigid fabric. He kept tugging at his collar, his calloused hands looking out of place holding a delicate crystal flute. Nancy wore a modest floral print dress, her silver hair pinned back neatly. They stood close together, an island of quiet humility in a sea of performative wealth. They looked incredibly uncomfortable in the very building they had mortgaged to save my life. They were the roots that had kept the entire operation alive, yet they shrank into the background, asking for nothing, expecting no credit, simply present to support the daughter they had chosen to love. I smoothed the front of my tailored black dress and stepped out from behind the steel tanks. The moment I entered the main floor, the crowd parted slightly, offering congratulatory murmurs. My mother spotted me. Her eyes lit up with a terrifying predatory brightness. She excused herself from the circle of executives and intercepted me near the edge of the stage, pulling me close under the guise of a loving maternal embrace. She smelled of expensive floral perfume and sharp mint. She leaned her head next to mine, smiling brightly for a nearby photographer, and lowered her voice to a harsh, urgent whisper. "The speeches are starting soon, darling," Helen murmured, her grip tightening on my arm. "The press is eager for the backstory. We have primed the room beautifully. Everyone is so moved by the family dynamic. When you get up on that stage, make sure you mention our initial seed investment. Just a brief acknowledgement of how we funded the early operations to get you off the ground. It will frame the transition perfectly for the buyers and show the reporters that this was a united family endeavor." She delivered the blatant lie without a single tremor in her voice. She was asking me to rewrite history in front of a room full of cameras, to publicly validate the fiction she had been selling for 5 years. She wanted me to look at the crowd, look at the Lawsons standing in the back, and hand the credit for our survival over to the people who had abandoned us. She believed the sheer pressure of the event, the presence of the corporate buyers, and the flashing cameras would force me into compliance. She assumed I would rather play along with the polite society script than cause a scene at my own victory party. I did not pull my arm away. I did not glare at her. I simply offered her a soft, compliant smile, the exact smile a dutiful daughter would give. "I will make sure everyone knows exactly what you contributed, Mom," I said smoothly. "I have the entire story prepared." Helen relaxed, a triumphant gleam flashing in her eyes. She patted my cheek, her tension evaporating. She turned and glided back to her seat in the front row, taking her place next to my father. They sat there radiating anticipation, ready to receive their public coronation. They adjusted their posture, ensuring they were perfectly framed for the impending photographs, whispering to each other in excited, hushed tones. A gentle chime rang through the venue, signaling the beginning of the formal announcements. The ambient music faded into silence. The event coordinator gestured toward the wooden stairs leading up to the small elevated platform. I walked up the steps, the wood creaking softly beneath my heels. I stepped behind the wooden podium and looked out over the sea of faces. The warm amber lights dimmed slightly, casting a dramatic focus onto the stage. The room went dead silent. The low murmur of conversation ceased entirely. The journalists raised their digital recorders. The photographers lifted their cameras, the lenses reflecting the stage lights. Gregory Tate and the corporate executives leaned forward, eager to finalize the transition. In the very back, Bill and Nancy stood together watching me with quiet, unwavering pride. And in the front row, sitting less than 10 feet away, my parents beamed at me, their faces glowing with arrogant expectation. I reached out and adjusted the microphone, the metallic screech echoing briefly through the high rafters. I wrapped my hands around the edges of the podium, feeling the rough grain of the wood under my calluses. I looked directly into my mother's expectant eyes. The trap had snapped shut. I leaned closer to the microphone. The harsh metallic feedback faded into a thick, expectant silence. I looked out over the sea of faces, past the glittering crystal centerpieces and the tailored suits, and let my eyes settle on the front row. My mother offered a tight, encouraging nod. She was ready for her tribute. She was waiting for me to validate the fiction she had spent half a decade spinning. I took a slow breath, filling my lungs with the scent of roasted rosemary and old cedar wood. "Welcome to Lawson's Graft," I said. My voice carried through the cavernous space, steady and clear, devoid of any trembling. "Many of you have tasted our vintage tonight. You have praised the flavor profile, the balance of the acidity, the unique character of the fruit. But excellent wine does not begin in the barrel. It begins in the dirt. It begins with a process that is as violent as it is beautiful." I paused, letting the words hang in the warm amber light. The corporate executives stopped whispering. The journalists lowered their pens, sensing a departure from the standard corporate acquisition script. "The Pinot Noir clone we cultivate here is fragile." I continued, pacing my words with deliberate precision. "It produces exceptional fruit, but the root system is weak. If you plant it directly into this volcanic soil, the winter frost will kill it. The pests will destroy it. It cannot survive on its own. The only way to keep that fragile branch alive is to find a tough native rootstock. You have to take a sharp blade, cut a deep notch into the strong wood, and force the vulnerable branch into the wound. You bind them together tightly. For months, the strong root bleeds its own sap, upward, sacrificing its own energy, pouring its life into the foreign branch until they fuse into a single organism." I looked directly at my father. He uncrossed his legs, the leather of his expensive shoes squeaking faintly against the concrete floor. He cleared his throat, a subtle signal of his growing discomfort. He preferred numbers and asset valuations. He did not like metaphors. "5 years ago," I said, my tone dropping to a quieter, more intimate register that forced the audience to lean in, "I was that fragile branch. I was 24 years old. I stood in a cemetery wearing a borrowed black dress, listening to the rain hit the lid of my husband's casket. I was holding 3 infants who had barely survived the neonatal intensive care unit. We had no income. We had an insurmountable mountain of medical debt. A few days later, a pink eviction notice was taped to my apartment door. I was left entirely homeless, carrying 3 starving babies in my arms. A low murmur rippled through the back of the room. The local politicians exchanged uncertain glances. This was not the polished, uplifting origin story they had been promised. This was raw, uncomfortable reality. In the front row, Helen's smile began to falter. The corners of her mouth twitched, struggling to maintain the facade of the proud, benevolent matriarch. Her manicured fingers gripped the edge of her silk clutch, the leather creaking under the sudden pressure. She darted a quick, panicked look at the food critic sitting 2 seats away. "I have heard the rumors circulating through this room tonight," I said, my gaze sweeping across the tables of wealthy Portland socialites. "I have heard the beautiful, inspiring stories being shared over champagne. Stories about a family united by a dream. Stories about parents who recognized their daughter's potential and provided a generous seed investment to launch this estate. I have heard the phrase tough love used to describe the space I was supposedly given to grow." I let the silence return thick and suffocating. I watched the realization begin to dawn on the faces of the people my parents had lied to. Victoria, the woman from the charity gala, narrowed her eyes, looking from me to my mother. I was not given space to grow. I stated the cold facts, slicing through the curated atmosphere. I was locked out in a freezing storm. I did not receive a seed investment to build a business. I received a closed door. I survived because a different kind of rootstock chose to bleed for me. I gestured toward the back of the room, past the glowing string lights and the eager reporters. The spotlight operator, catching my cue, swung a beam of warm light toward the loading dock doors. Bill and Nancy Lawson stood there, frozen in the sudden illumination. Bill looked down at his scuffed dress shoes, his face flushed. Nancy stood tall, her chin raised, holding her husband's arm. Those 2 people did not have a retirement portfolio to protect. I said, my voice echoing with fierce, unwavering clarity. They were facing their own bank foreclosure. Their farm was failing, and their only son had just died. They had nothing left to give. But when I showed up on their porch in the middle of the night, they did not ask for a business plan. They did not calculate my liability. Martin shifted heavily in his chair. He reached up and loosened his silk tie, his face turning a deep mottled shade of red. The journalists in the second row lifted their cameras, sensing the imminent collapse of a major social dynasty. The shutter clicks sounded like rapid gunfire in the quiet barn. Bill Lawson did not write me a check. I continued, keeping my eyes locked on my father. He walked into his office, carried out his desk, and spent the entire night cutting and sanding pine boards to build 3 rustic cribs so my children would not have to sleep on the floor. Nancy Lawson did not offer me tough love. She stayed awake until dawn, pacing the worn floorboards, rocking colicky preemies against her shoulder so I could get 1 hour of uninterrupted sleep. They mortgaged the last remaining equity on this land to buy formula and diapers. The crowd was mesmerized. The corporate executives from London set their wineglasses down, their eyes darting between my commanding presence on the stage and the wealthy couple shrinking in the front row. The narrative had shifted irreversibly. The elite members of polite society, the very people Helen had spent years cultivating, were turning their heads. They looked at my parents, dissecting the crisp suits and the expensive pearls, seeing the hollow, transactional cruelty hidden beneath the fabric. Helen's face drained of color. She looked pale, fragile, and suddenly very old. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to interrupt or to salvage her shattered reputation, but her voice failed her. The sheer weight of the room's judgment pinned her to the wooden chair. "We survived because Bill and Nancy grafted us onto their own failing roots," I said, gripping the edges of the podium. "They poured their own life into us until we were strong enough to bear fruit. That is the only reason this vineyard exists. That is the only reason there is anything here to sell." I reached down into the hidden shelf beneath the wooden podium. My fingers brushed against the smooth, thick paper of a heavy manila folder. I had prepared this specific collection of documents with Elaine. It was the physical manifestation of the truth, a collection of undeniable receipts ready to dismantle the final remnants of my parents' manufactured myth. I pulled the manila folder up and placed it squarely on the surface of the podium. The heavy paper slapped against the wood, a sharp, defining sound that signaled the end of the polite fiction. I rested my calloused hands on top of the closed cover, looking down at the 2 people who had thrown me away, ready to show the world exactly what their love had cost. I opened the heavy manila folder. The stiff paper rasped against the rough wooden surface of the podium. The barn remained still, filled with a quiet so dense it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. Every eye in the room tracked my movements. The corporate buyers, the local politicians, the wine critics with their leather notebooks all leaned forward in their chairs. I reached inside the folder and bypassed the thick stacks of bank statements and loan agreements. My calloused fingers found a small flat object resting at the bottom. I pulled out a simple square of glass bordered in cheap black plastic. I held it up under the warm amber stage lights. Pressed between the two panes of glass were several jagged, water-stained pieces of paper meticulously taped back together to form a recognizable rectangle. It was a check. The date ink had faded, but the bold numbers written across the center remained distinct. $500. I have heard a story circulating through this room tonight, I said, my voice echoing off the high cedar rafters. A beautiful narrative about how I was given space to grow. How my parents stepped back so I could find my own footing in the world. This glass frame holds that space. I turned the frame slightly so the light caught the signature line. This is a check for $500. It was handed to me at the back door of a luxury estate in Lake Oswego 5 years ago. I had just driven there in a rusted car with 3 newborn babies. I was carrying a pink eviction notice. I begged my parents for the use of an empty room above their garage, just for a few weeks, so my children would not have to sleep in the cold. I looked down at my father. He sat frozen in the front row, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the armrests of his oak chair. My father looked at his homeless daughter and his 3 infant grandchildren. I said, projecting the words clearly across the silent room. He did not offer us a room. He offered this check and he gave me an explanation. He said, "We spent 24 years investing in your future, Hazel. We won't let your bad luck bankrupt our retirement." In the second row, a prominent journalist for a regional lifestyle magazine flipped his notebook open. His pen scratched furiously across the page. The sound carried in the quiet barn a sharp, rhythmic documentation of the truth. The corporate executives from the beverage conglomerate exchanged sharp, uneasy glances. The polite fiction my parents had spent years curating was dissolving in real time, exposed under the bright stage lights. My mother could not endure the exposure. Her entire identity rested on the foundation of her social standing, and I was pulling the stones out one by one. Helen pushed her chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the concrete floor. She stood up, her burgundy silk dress rustling in the tense air. "Hazel, please," Helen said, forcing a brittle, wavering laugh that sounded like cracking ice. "You are clearly overwhelmed by the emotion of the evening. This is a private family matter. There is no need to air private misunderstandings in front of our guests. Let us step down and celebrate your success." She looked around the front rows, expecting the wealthy politicians and socialites to nod in agreement to rescue her from the discomfort. She expected polite society to intervene and restore the comfortable illusion she had sold them. She received nothing. The crowd stared back at her with icy, unforgiving silence. The women she had shared champagne with earlier now looked at her as if she were carrying a contagious disease. No one offered a sympathetic smile. The suffocating quiet of the room pressed down on her, a physical manifestation of their collective rejection. Her attempt to control the narrative withered in the cold air. Martin reached up and grabbed her wrist. He pulled her hard, forcing her back into her seat. His face was a mask of furious humiliation. He understood the dynamics of a boardroom, and he knew they had lost the room. I turned my attention away from the front row. The anger that had sustained me for 5 years felt like a burned-out match, replaced by a profound, clarifying gratitude. I looked toward the shadows near the loading dock doors, searching for the people who had actually saved my life. "Bill, Nancy," I called out, my voice softening. "Please come up here." The older couple hesitated. They were not accustomed to the spotlight. They preferred the quiet dignity of a finished workday and the privacy of their own kitchen. The guests seated near the back parted respectfully, creating a wide aisle. Bill placed his hand on the small of Nancy's back, guiding her forward. They walked down the center of the barn, their worn dress shoes stepping carefully over the concrete. The contrast between them and the polished executives surrounding them was stark. They carried the history of the valley in their posture. They climbed the wooden steps and stood beside me on the elevated platform. Bill looked down at the crowd, his broad shoulders stiff under his dark suit. Nancy reached out and wrapped her hand around my arm, offering the same steady comfort she had given me on my darkest nights. I reached back into the manila folder on the podium. I pulled out a thick stack of stapled official documents. These pages bore the heavy crest of a regional agricultural bank filled with dense legal text and rows of accounting figures. My parents spoke to you tonight about seed investments, I said, holding the bank documents up for the audience to see. They wanted you to believe they funded the genesis of this estate. These pages tell the actual story of our funding. This is the paperwork for a second mortgage. I turned to look at the guests making eye contact with the silent crowd. When my husband died, the Lawson family farm was already struggling. They were drowning in debt, fighting to keep a legacy alive. When I arrived on their doorstep, I brought 3 extra mouths to feed. They did not have the capital to support us. So they went to the bank. They leveraged the last remaining equity they possessed. They put their own home on the line, risking total ruin to buy infant formula diapers and a used double stroller. I placed the mortgage documents next to the glass frame on the podium. They did not demand a business plan in return. They did not ask for a percentage of my future earnings. They gave everything they had left to a grieving widow because they believed it was the right thing to do. That is what an actual seed investment looks like. It does not come from surplus wealth. It comes from sacrifice. I looked down at the front row. Martin sat rigid, his eyes fixed on the concrete floor. Helen stared straight ahead, her face pale and drawn. The 29 years they had spent climbing the social ladder of Portland, carefully curating their image and associating with the elite, vaporized in the span of 5 minutes. The whispers began to ripple through the audience. The wine critics shook their heads in disgust. The politicians subtly shifted their chairs, creating physical distance from my parents. The ruination was total. They were exposed, laid bare under the bright amber lights, stripped of the unearned glory they had come to claim. Family is not a biological obligation, I said into the microphone, my voice steady and resolute. Family is the soil that holds you when the winter comes. I survived the frost because Bill and Nancy Lawson refused to let me freeze. They are the true founders of this estate. I am simply the hands that did the work. The silence held for a single heartbeat before the room erupted. The applause started in the back row and swept forward like a sudden wave. The corporate executives stood up, clapping with genuine respect. The journalists lowered their cameras to join the ovation. Bill squeezed his eyes shut, nodding slowly while Nancy wiped a single tear from her cheek. I stood between them, letting the sound wash over us, feeling the final heavy chains of my past break and fall away. As the applause began to taper off, the event coordinator stepped forward from the wings. He carried a sleek black leather portfolio. Gregory Tate, the acquisitions director from the beverage conglomerate, approached the base of the stairs. He held a silver fountain pen, his expression a mix of awe and eager anticipation. The time for storytelling had ended. The moment of transaction had arrived. The coordinator placed the leather portfolio onto the podium, right over the glass frame, and the mortgage documents. He opened the cover. Inside sat a thick stack of legal contracts, the final sale agreement for $150 million. I picked up the silver pen, feeling the cool metal against my palm. I looked down at the signature line, ready to finalize the victory and secure the future for the only people who mattered. The silver fountain pen rested heavy in my hand. I stared down at the crisp white pages of the acquisition contract resting on the wooden podium. The fine print detailed the transfer of the vineyard, the brand, the production facilities, and the soil itself. In exchange, the beverage conglomerate would wire $150 million into the designated accounts. I pressed the metal nib against the thick paper. The ink flowed dark and permanent. I signed my first name, then my last, looping the letters with steady, practiced precision. I turned the page, initialed the margins, and signed the final addendum. Gregory Tate reached forward and gently pulled the leather portfolio across the podium. He inspected the signatures, offered a brisk professional nod, and closed the cover. The transaction was official. The money was moving. My father saw the leather binder close. He saw the executives shaking my hand. He knew the capital had just been unlocked. Panic overrode his decades of country club conditioning. He could not wait for a private meeting. He could not wait for the press to leave. The sheer volume of the wealth blinded him to the setting. Hazel, my father shouted from the front row, his voice slicing through the polite applause. The sudden outburst echoed off the high cedar rafters. The journalist paused. The string quartet, which had just begun to tune their instruments for the reception, fell silent. The entire room turned their attention back to the stage. My father stepped forward, leaving my mother sitting frozen in her oak chair. He walked to the very edge of the elevated platform. He looked up at me, his face tight with a desperate, hungry urgency. He tried to soften his tone to make it sound like a loving reminder rather than a frantic demand, but his greed bled through every syllable. "The family fund," Hazel, my father urged, gesturing toward the microphone. "We discussed this in Portland, the investment fund. Tell them about the 50 million. He was trying to force my hand in front of the buyers. He believed that if he announced his financial stake in front of the press, he could corner me into a public verbal contract. He thought I was still vulnerable to his boardroom tactics, still craving his approval, still willing to surrender a third of my life to buy his affection. I stood behind the wooden podium. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I let the silence etch, allowing his desperate demand to settle into the ears of every politician, critic, and executive in the room. I looked down at his tailored suit and his expensive leather shoes. I felt an icy, profound calm settle over my shoulders. "There is a family fund, Martin," I said, my voice echoing clear and sharp through the speakers. "I promised you we would announce the financial restructuring tonight. I intend to keep that promise." I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out a small black remote. I aimed it toward the back of the barn and pressed a single button. Above the stage, a motorized canvas screen slowly unrolled from the ceiling, descending behind me with a low, mechanical hum. The stage lights dimmed automatically. A high-definition projector mounted near the steel fermentation tanks clicked to life. A bright beam of white light cut through the ambient darkness, illuminating the large canvas screen. A legal document appeared behind me, the text crisp and legible, magnified, so every person in the room could read the fine print. It was the paperwork I had finalized with Elaine. It bore the heavy, undeniable stamp of the county registry and the pristine seal of a certified notary public. "This is the structural blueprint for the new financial entity," I announced, turning slightly to gesture toward the glowing screen. "All proceeds from tonight's transaction have been routed directly into this account. It is an irrevocable trust. For those unfamiliar with estate law, that means the structure is permanent. The assets can never be reclaimed, altered, or redistributed by outside parties." My father smiled, a tight, eager expression. He still believed he had won. He assumed the document behind me was the vehicle for his $50 million payout. He waited for me to read his name. "The entity is officially registered as the Lawson Graft Irrevocable Trust." I read aloud, tracing the lines of text with my eyes. "Total capitalization stands at $150 million. I pressed the button on the remote again. The document on the screen scrolled downward, revealing the specific ironclad clauses Elaine had drafted. The bold heading read, "Beneficiary Designations." "The primary beneficiaries of this trust are Noah Kingsley, Liam Kingsley, and Harper Kingsley," I stated, my voice ringing with undeniable finality. "They hold the protective equity. The secondary beneficiaries, vested with immediate lifetime security provisions and full operational oversight, are William Lawson and Nancy Lawson." I looked down at the front row. My father stopped breathing. His eager smile vanished, replaced by a blank, uncomprehending stare. My mother gripped the edge of her seat, her knuckles turning a stark, translucent white. They scanned the glowing text, searching frantically for their own names. "Total allocation of all funds," I said, pronouncing each word with lethal precision, "is 100%. The ledger is closed." My father opened his mouth, a silent gasp escaping his lips. He took a staggering step back, his polished leather shoes scraping loudly against the concrete. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. There was no $50 million. There was no joint entity. There was no managing director position for him to exploit. But I was not finished. The trap had one final devastating spring. I clicked the remote a third time. The document scrolled to the very last page. A specific addendum appeared on the screen, highlighted in stark, unyielding black text. You asked me to protect this wealth from predatory forces, I said, staring directly into my father's wide, panicked eyes. I took your advice. I had my attorney draft a specific disinheritance clause. I turned to the screen and read the final paragraph aloud, ensuring the entire room heard the legal execution of my parents. Let the registry show that Martin and Helen are hereby explicitly and permanently excluded from this trust. I read my voice carrying the weight of a gavel dropping in a silent courtroom. They hold zero legal standing. They are entitled to zero financial distribution. They are barred from challenging this entity in any probate court, civil proceeding, or familial dispute. Their exclusion is total, binding, and eternal. The barn descended into a shocking, breathless quiet. The corporate executives from London, men who dealt in hostile takeovers and ruthless acquisitions, stared at the screen in profound awe. They recognized the titanium architecture of the legal document. They knew exactly what I had done. I had not just denied my parents a payout, I had legally vaporized their existence from my lineage. The color drained entirely from my mother's face. She looked as though she had been struck by lightning. Her elegant burgundy dress seemed to swallow her shrinking frame. The carefully constructed facade she had maintained for 29 years shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. The wealthy peers she had spent her life trying to impress were now staring at her with undisguised pity and revulsion. My father stood frozen in the center of the aisle. The authoritative posture he relied upon to intimidate his rivals crumbled. His shoulders sagged. His hands trembled at his sides. He looked up at the projection screen, reading the disinheritance clause over and over again, unable to process the magnitude of his defeat. He had tried to treat his daughter like a transaction, and he had just been bankrupted by his own arithmetic. The journalists in the second row lifted their cameras. The blinding flash of strobe lights erupted, capturing the exact moment of my parents' social and financial ruin. They were trapped in the glare of the lenses, documented forever, as the people who had abandoned a grieving widow, only to be legally erased from her historic triumph. They had come to the vineyard expecting to claim a fortune and secure their legacy. Instead, they stood in the center of the room, stripped of their power, stripped of their narrative, and exiled from the wealth they had coveted. The flashbulbs continued to pop, casting harsh, rapid shadows across the reclaimed oak tables. The local politicians, individuals who survived on public perception, physically distanced themselves from the front row. They shifted their chairs backward, creating a visible empty perimeter around my mother and father. No one wanted to be associated with the devastation unfolding on the floor. I looked down at the two people who had given me life. I did not feel a rush of hot, triumphant adrenaline. I did not feel the urge to gloat. What I felt was a deep, profound stillness. The lingering ghost of the desperate 24-year-old girl who had cried in their driveway finally went quiet. She did not need their approval anymore. She did not need their shelter. The trust document hovered above me, glowing bright and irrefutable. It was a shield forged from paper and ink, defending the Lawsons and my children from the predatory reach of the people who should have loved us. Martin and Helen were left with nothing but the empty space they had created. They stood under the warm amber lights, surrounded by the elite society they worshipped, having lost the only investment that ever truly mattered. The flashbulbs ceased their blinding rhythm. The applause that had thundered through the converted tractor barn faded into a dense, uncomfortable quiet. The event coordinator standing near the tasting room signaled the catering staff with a sharp nod. Waiters began silently clearing the reclaimed oak tables, their silver trays clinking softly against the discarded crystal wine glasses. The guests did not linger to offer their polite goodbyes. The high society Portlanders, the influential charity board members, and the wealthy executives. My mother had spent decades cultivating, moved toward the heavy wooden doors in a swift, synchronized exodus. A prominent wine critic, a woman my mother had shared an expensive bottle of champagne with just an hour earlier, averted her eyes and walked briskly past the front row. Local politicians checked their phones, pretending to read urgent emails, creating a wide physical perimeter around the two people left sitting in the center aisle. Martin and Helen were suddenly radioactive. To be seen engaging with them was social suicide. The ambient chatter faded into the crisp autumn night. The corporate legal team gathered their briefcases, offering me a final respectful nod before retreating to the private office to finalize the wire transfers. The cavernous barn felt vast and hollow. Only the string quartet remained in the far corner, quietly packing their cellos and violins into velvet-lined cases. My father watched the last local journalist step out into the gravel parking lot. The realization that his public humiliation was documented and irreversible seemed to snap the final thread of his restraint. The polished, calculating real estate developer vanished. He charged toward the wooden steps of the stage, his face flushed a dark, angry crimson. His expensive leather shoes struck the concrete floor with heavy, aggressive thuds. "How could you do this?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the high cedar rafters. "We are your parents, Hazel. We share the same blood. You stand up there and publicly humiliate us in front of our peers over a $500 check. After everything we provided for you growing up." I did not shrink back. I picked up the leather portfolio containing the signed acquisition contracts and walked down the wooden stairs. I met him on the main floor, standing on the same concrete surface where I had scrubbed spilled wine and tracked mud for 5 years. I was no longer looking down at him from an elevated podium. I met his gaze directly level and unyielding. Bill and Nancy moved from the shadows near the loading dock to stand beside me. They did not say a word, but their presence formed a solid, immovable wall at my back. I looked at the man who had tried to extort a third of my life's work under the guise of paternal protection. He was breathing heavily, his fists clenched at his sides. "You said you could not fund a tragedy," I said, keeping my voice soft, letting the quiet words carry the full weight of the boundary. "So I made sure you would not have to manage a triumph." The sentence hung in the cool air, sharp and definitive. My father opened his mouth, searching for a counter-argument, a business strategy, a legal loophole. He found nothing. He had spent his entire career evaluating risk and reward, predicting market fluctuations, and corporate leverage. He had fundamentally miscalculated the value of his own daughter. He had treated my survival as a bad investment, and now the ledger was closed. My mother stepped forward, her burgundy silk dress rustling in the quiet barn. She fell back on the only tactic she had left. Helen attempted to weep. She let out a ragged, theatrical sob, burying her face in her manicured hands, her shoulders shaking with practiced grief. She expected someone to rush forward to offer a tissue to console the devastated matriarch. She peeked through her fingers, scanning the room for an audience. She found only empty chairs and half-eaten plates of roasted rosemary chicken. The wealthy socialites and charity committee members were gone. The local reporters were in their cars typing their headlines and sending the photos to their editors. A busboy carrying a plastic tub of dirty silverware paused, gave her a bewildered glance, and walked through the swinging doors into the catering kitchen. Her tears held no currency without a crowd to manipulate. Her performance fell flat against the cold concrete and the weathered wood. Helen lowered her hands. Her eyes were dry. The realization that her tears possessed no power over me or the Lawsons drained the last bit of fight from her posture. She looked around the empty venue, the golden amber lights casting long shadows across the rustic tables, and finally understood the scale of her isolation. She had built her entire identity on the perception of others, and those others had just walked out the door. Bill stepped forward. He did not puff out his chest or raise his voice. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who had spent his life working the soil and weathering brutal storms. He closed the distance between us and my father. Bill raised his right hand. His skin was rough-scarred from decades of repairing barbed wire fences and handling heavy tractor equipment. He placed that calloused hand firmly on my father's tailored shoulder. The physical contrast was jarring. The pristine wool of the expensive suit yielded under the weight of a farmer's grip. Bill did not squeeze or threaten. He simply let his hand rest there, a quiet, undeniable anchor of authority. "It is time for you folks to leave the property," Bill said. His voice was low, carrying a gentle but unyielding gravel tone. "It is getting late and my family needs to rest." My father looked down at the hand resting on his shoulder. He looked at Bill's weathered face, recognizing a type of strength he could not buy or intimidate. He looked back at me one final time, searching for a trace of the frightened 24-year-old girl he had locked out in the rain. He found only a woman who owned the ground she stood on. Martin shrugged off the heavy hand. He turned his back on me, grabbing my mother's arm. He steered her toward the wide double doors of the barn. They did not speak. They did not look back. Their footsteps echoed in the vast empty space, a hollow retreat. I walked to the threshold of the loading dock doors and watched them cross the gravel parking lot. The silver Mercedes sat alone under the pale glow of a single security light. The sleek luxury vehicle looked small and insignificant against the sprawling backdrop of the dark rolling hills and the dark vine rows. The engine roared to life, the headlights cutting a sharp beam through the gathering mist. The car shifted into gear. The tires spun briefly on the wet gravel before gripping the dirt. I stood next to Nancy, her arm wrapped securely around my waist, watching the red taillights recede down the long, rutted driveway. The vehicle reached the end of the property line, turning onto the paved county road pointing north toward Portland. The taillights grew smaller and smaller until they vanished entirely behind a dense cluster of ancient oak trees. The sound of the engine faded into the ambient noise of the crickets and the gentle rustle of the wind moving through the grape leaves. They were gone. The boundary was sealed. I took a deep cleansing breath of the cold night air, feeling the damp soil and the sweet scent of crushed fruit fill my lungs. The phantom weight of their approval. The invisible chain I had carried for 29 years finally snapped. I turned away from the dark road, stepping back into the warm, golden light of the barn, closing the heavy wooden doors on the past forever. 6 months passed. The Willamette Valley slowly thawed, shedding the biting winter frost for the vibrant waking green of early spring. The relentless rain softened into a gentle morning mist that burned off by noon, leaving the rolling hills bathed in pale golden sunlight. In Portland, the fallout from the harvest gala settled into a quiet, permanent exile for my parents. A guest had recorded my speech on their mobile phone. The digital video spread rapidly through the insular social circles of the city, passing swiftly from country club dining rooms to charity board meetings. It was not a loud scandal. Polite society rarely shouts. They simply close doors. Helen and Martin found their coveted invitations drying up. The philanthropic committees my mother had chaired for a decade found sudden polite reasons to restructure their leadership boards without her. My father noticed his premium golf tee times being canceled by long-standing corporate partners. They had spent decades building a rigid identity based entirely on public perception, and once that perception cracked, the entire foundation crumbled. I felt no joy in their isolation. I did not celebrate their ruin. It was just the basic, undeniable arithmetic of their own choices. They had valued superficial status over the survival of their own child, and in the end, they lost both. Down in the valley, my freedom looked much less dramatic. The irrevocable trust held more capital than I could ever spend in a dozen lifetimes. Yet my daily rhythm remained remarkably unchanged. We used a small fraction of the funds to renovate the farmhouse. We fixed the sagging roof, replaced the drafty windows, and updated the old copper plumbing. The exterior kept its weathered white paint and the wide, rustic wooden porch. The house still smelled of cedar wood smoke and strong morning coffee. I still woke up before dawn. I still wore heavy denim and scuffed leather boots. Wealth did not erase the thick calluses on my hands, nor did I want it to. Those marks were the permanent map of my survival. The beverage conglomerate officially took over the daily operations of the commercial vineyard. They brought in their own managers, their own logistical teams, and their own supply chains. I fulfilled my ongoing consulting role, offering specific guidance on navigating the microclimate and managing the delicate grafting process, but the crushing burden of financial debt was gone. For the first time in 5 long years, I could stand on the porch and look out at the 40 acres of vines without calculating profit margins or fearing a sudden bank foreclosure. The suffocating weight of survival had finally lifted off my chest, leaving a deep and quiet peace in its place. It was a Tuesday morning. I sat on the top step of the newly reinforced wooden veranda. The air was crisp, carrying the sweet scent of blooming wildflowers and turned earth. In the sprawling front yard, Bill and Nancy chased Noah, Liam, and Harper through the tall green grass. The children were 5 years old, an energetic blur of motion and bright laughter. Bill had built a sturdy wooden swing set near the old oak tree, using sanded pine boards. He pushed Harper high into the air, her joyous shouts echoing across the open property. Nancy sat nearby on a woven wool blanket, helping Noah and Liam sort a pile of smooth river stones they had collected from the creek bed. The deep lines of worry that used to frame her eyes had smoothed out. Bill moved with a lighter step, the chronic stress of impending bankruptcy no longer bowing his broad shoulders. They were finally free to be grandparents, unburdened by the frightening prospect of losing their ancestral home. They could simply enjoy the sunlight and the children they loved. I held a warm ceramic mug of dark coffee in one hand. In my lap rested a fresh yellow legal pad. I held a black pen sketching out the foundational framework for a new project. I remembered the heavy metallic dread of staring at pink eviction notices on an apartment door. I remembered the cold, dismissive gaze of commercial loan officers telling me I was a bad risk. I was drafting the charter for a robust community agricultural grant program. The trust would establish a dedicated endowment to provide zero-interest loans and emergency relief grants to young, struggling farmers across the Pacific Northwest. We would offer the crucial lifeline that no traditional bank would extend. We would purchase the overdue equipment, cover the unexpected property taxes, and fund the emergency irrigation systems when the summer droughts hit. We would be the safety net that caught the desperate families falling through the bureaucratic cracks. We would provide the soil they needed to take root. A sudden rustling in the grass pulled my attention away from the yellow legal pad. Liam detached himself from the group on the blanket and ran toward the house. His small rubber boots thumped against the wooden steps. His hands and knees were covered in dark, rich topsoil. He stopped in front of me, a wide, gap-toothed smile spreading across his flushed face. He held his hands out, eager to present his latest treasure. Resting in his muddy palms was a small, fragile plant. It was a sturdy native rootstock, thick and resilient, with a delicate green scion bound tightly to its side, using a strip of green grafting tape. He had watched me perform the delicate procedure in the temperature-controlled greenhouse dozens of times over the years. He had planted this specific one himself in a small terracotta starter pot, watering it diligently for weeks. The tiny green leaves of the fruiting branch were vibrant and alive, drawing their vital strength upward from the tough, unyielding root. The fragile wood had healed, fusing cleanly into the stronger host. I set my coffee mug down on the wooden planks next to the legal pad. I took the small grafted vine from his hands, feeling the damp, cool soil brush against my skin. I looked out over the yard. Bill was catching Harper at the bottom of the slide, pulling her into a tight hug. Nancy was laughing as Noah tried to balance a gray river stone on top of his head. The morning sun bathed the entire farm in a warm, golden glow. I pulled Liam close, pressing a kiss to his forehead, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against my chest. The long, bitter winter was finally over. The frost had melted and the ground was soft and ready for new life. I had learned the hardest and most beautiful truth the earth had to offer. Family isn't the soil you are dropped into. It is the rootstock that chooses to hold you up when the frost comes.
We often measure a successful American upbringing by the milestones we can frame on a wall. We celebrate the prestigious college degrees, the polished weddings, and the thriving careers. We tend to treat parenthood like a delicate ledger, balancing the time we spend against the social dividends our children yield. In a culture that frequently glorifies individualism and material success, it becomes dangerously easy to lose sight of what truly binds a family together. The story of Hazel Kingsley forces us to look past the manicured lawns and ask a much harder question. When the winter comes and the accolades fade, what exactly remains of the family we built? Hazel's journey from a grieving widow locked out in the freezing rain to the architect of her own salvation is more than a tale of survival. It holds up a mirror to the way we raise our children, urging us to examine the quiet, hidden soil where our true values take root. In our modern society, ambition often masquerades as affection. Parents like Martin and Helen confused their own egos with parental duty. They viewed their daughter not as a beating heart, but as an extension of their social portfolio. When her life veered off the planned trajectory, when tragedy struck and she needed them the most, they calculated the risk and cut their losses. They called it tough love. They handed her a $500 check to buy their way out of a messy reality, shielding their country club reputation from the stain of failure. True family responsibility does not retreat when the rain starts falling. We see the profound contrast in Bill and Nancy Lawson. They were drowning in debt, their farm failing, yet they dismantled their own home to build cribs for children that were not their own blood. They represent the quiet humility that forms the bedrock of a genuine family structure. As parents, our highest moral duty is not to fund a flawless future, but to become the strong, unwavering rootstock our children can graft themselves onto when their own branches break. We must teach them through our daily actions that love is not a transaction, it is a sanctuary. We live in a society that frequently rewards the wrong things. We chase the corner office, the luxury sedan, and the admiring whispers of our peers. This blind pursuit creates a dangerous illusion. Hazel's parents prided themselves on their financial intelligence, yet they suffered from a profound poverty of wisdom. They priced their daughter's worth at the cost of a month of rent, failing to see the quiet, enduring strength she carried inside. Wealth and status are fragile constructs. They can vanish overnight or change hands with a single signature on an irrevocable trust. Hazel possessed the clarity to see through the hollow promises of high society. She understood that true wealth is found in the dirt, in the calloused hands of the people who stand by you when you have nothing left to offer them. Guiding our children requires us to dismantle this illusion of materialism. We must raise them to value honesty and fairness over public perception. We must instill in them the wisdom to recognize authentic loyalty. If we teach our children to chase the spotlight, we leave them vulnerable to the dark. If we teach them to cherish the soil, they will always know how to grow and thrive. Perhaps the most vital lesson Hazel offers is her definition of resilience. True resilience does not demand an audience. When Hazel faced the ultimate betrayal, she did not dissolve into victimhood. She did not scream at her parents in the church vestibule or throw glasses in a crowded restaurant. She took her pain, knelt in the freezing mud, and turned it into a quiet, relentless focus. Emotional awareness in a traditional family does not mean tolerating abuse in the name of blood. It means possessing the courage to draw a firm boundary. Hazel used silence, patience, and cold legal facts to protect her children and the people who saved her. She demonstrated that the most profound strength lies in calmness. By refusing to match her parents' cruelty, she broke the cycle of conditional affection. This is the legacy we must pass down to the next generation. We must equip our children with the inner fortitude to endure hardship, to stand up after a devastating loss, and to enforce boundaries with grace rather than venom. We must teach them that walking away from toxicity is sometimes the bravest act of love they can perform for their own children. The downfall of Martin and Helen is a sobering reminder that we reap exactly what we sow. They lost their fortune, their reputation, and their daughter, not because of a sudden stroke of bad luck, but because the seeds of their own selfishness finally bore fruit. It forces us to pause and look closely at our own reflections. Are we raising our children with a spirit of generosity, or are we managing them like assets on a spreadsheet? Are we building a home rooted in unconditional support, or are we simply curating a gallery of achievements? The answers to these questions define the shape of the generations that follow us. If these stories of quiet strength and enduring justice resonate with you, please subscribe to Orange Vengeance. We explore the deep, unspoken currents of family life, sharing narratives that challenge us to become better versions of ourselves. Consider the seeds you planted this morning. You water them, you trim the stray leaves, and you wait for the season to turn. You build your fences and you paint your porch. But someday a bitter frost will descend on the garden you tended so carefully. When the cold settles deep into the earth and the fragile branches begin to crack under the weight of the ice, you will find out exactly what kind of roots you allowed to grow in the dark.